Tribunal was adjourned. Charles Haughey admits he knew 4 years ago that Ben Dunn paid him 1.3 million. The tribunal hears Mr Dunn offered $1 million this year towards Mr Haughey's tax bill. Another battalion for the north, troop strength now stands at 17,500. And the ruling by the Nevada State Athletic Commission leaves Tyson on the canvas. Good evening and welcome. The former Taoiseach Charles Haughey has admitted receiving £1.3 million from Ben Dunn. Mr Haughey made the admission in a statement that was read to the Dunn's Payments Tribunal by his senior counsel. The tribunal was also told that this year Mr Dunn offered to pay £1 million towards Mr Haughey's tax bill if he made a full disclosure about the payments he had received from Mr Dunn. Following the dramatic developments at the tribunal, the Taoiseach said in the Dáil that he would cover for nobody, but he refused a request from the Fine Gael leader John Bruton to agree in principle to establish a new inquiry. In the first of our reports tonight, Charlie Baird has the details of Mr Haughey's statement read to the tribunal this morning and of the events that led up to it.
Over the past 2.5 months, the McCracken Tribunal has produced some sensations, but none on the scale of what happened here at Dublin Castle this morning. Today's developments are probably some of the most dramatic in Irish political life in almost 30 years. After 2 days of frustrating adjournments, just after 10:30, the former Taoiseach senior counsel Ian McGonigal rose to his feet and made what was a complete reversal of Mr Charles Haughey's previous position. In the brief statement, which runs to just under 200 words, Charles Haughey says, as a result of reviewing the excellent work of the tribunal and considering the very helpful documentation recently received from Mr Dunn's solicitors, I now accept that I received £1.3 million from Ben Dunn, and that he was the donor to the late Mr Traynor in 1993. And furthermore, I now accept Mr Dunn's evidence that he handed me £210,000 in Abbeyville in November 1991. He also said that in making this statement, I wish to make it clear that until yesterday, I had mistakenly instructed my legal team. In his original letter to the tribunal, Mr Haughey said he had no knowledge of receiving any payments in cash or in kind of the nature referred to in the terms of reference of the tribunal. And in her evidence to the inquiry, Margaret Heffernan said that when she put it to the former Taoiseach that he had received over £1 million from Mr Dunn, Mr Haughey told her he felt Ben was unstable. Also in replies to letters from Dunn's store solicitors seeking the return of the money, Mr Haughey said as no such money was given, therefore none had to be repaid. What's still not clear this evening is what prompted Charles Haughey to make this dramatic statement, which has completely reversed his previous position. Certainly the tribunal legal team has come up with new information linking Mr Haughey to the Dunn's payments. And there's also the contents of the now famous brown envelope, dealing with the conversations between Mr Haughey and Ben Dunn's solicitor, Noel Smith. The tribunal itself is now likely to complete its work by the middle of next week, once Mr Haughey himself gives evidence. But the repercussions, the fallout from what's happened here, may only be starting.
Noel Smith, Mr Dunn's solicitor, told the tribunal Ben Dunn had offered in February of this year to pay £1 million towards Mr Haughey's tax bill if Mr Haughey made a full disclosure to the inquiry. David McCullough reports on Noel Smith's evidence that the former Taoiseach said it would be impossible for him to accept the money from Mr Dunn.
2.5 months after he first revealed that he had had discussions with Mr Haughey about the work of the tribunal, Noel Smith was finally able to give evidence about the contacts today. Mr Smith, who is Ben Dunn's solicitor, outlined 2 sets of meetings with the former Taoiseach. The first set took place in 1994, while Ben Dunn was planning a legal action against other members of the family. Part of the evidence he was planning to present related to the payments he had made to Mr Haughey, and in early 1994 Mr Smith told Mr Haughey about the litigation. Mr Haughey told him that he had not received the money, but at a second meeting some days later he appeared agitated and said that the allegations could have a devastating impact on him. Mr Smith promised to keep in touch, and telephone logs from his office produced at the tribunal today show 20 phone calls to him from Mr Haughey during that year. When Mr Smith told Mr Haughey in November 1994 that the litigation had been settled, the former Taoiseach said that's a relief. Mr Smith then described further context at the time the Larry affair first came to light late last year. At a meeting in Kinseely, Mr Smith questioned Mr Haughey about the 3 bank drafts worth £210,000 which Ben Dunn remembered handing over to him. Mr Haughey didn't acknowledge receiving the drafts, but said they could be a source of some embarrassment to him. He told Mr Smith he thought they'd been paid into an account in the Irish Intercontinental Bank belonging to or associated with the late Des Traynor. Mr Smith said he didn't want to use the word panic to describe Mr Haughey's reaction, but for a short time he was looking for a way out and asked what they could do about the drafts. Their final meeting last February followed a discussion between Mr Smith and Ben Dunn, when Mr Smith estimated that Mr Haughey would face a tax bill of at least £1 million because of the payments. Mr Dunn told him to offer £1 million to be paid on account to the tax authorities if Mr Haughey made a full disclosure to the tribunal. Mr Smith said he told the former Taoiseach that the tribunal would have wide powers and would be able to unearth all the information it needed. Mr Haughey described the offer as very gracious, but said it would be impossible for him to accept the money.
The Taoiseach has described today's revelations as tragic and deplorable. However, he refused a request from the Fine Gael leader John Bruton to agree in principle to establish a new inquiry. Our political correspondent Una Claffey has filed this report on reaction in the Dáil to Mr Haughey's statement.
In a highly charged Dáil atmosphere, John Bruton pressed the Taoiseach hard for the establishment of a new inquiry.
And I'm asking if the government are going to bring forward a motion to establish an inquiry to establish if other people made personal donations to Mr Haughey while Mr Haughey was Taoiseach and was serving in government with Fianna Fáil and the Progressive Democrats.
He was joined by the Labour leader Dick Spring, who wanted a special sitting of the House to look into the matters.
The Taoiseach, when leading the opposition on the 6th of February 1997 address in this House, said, "What matters most is how a political party reacts to the knowledge when it becomes available." Well, today is an extraordinary day in Irish politics by any measure, when the former Taoiseach, the former leader of Fianna Fáil, has now admitted receiving £1.3 million from Ben Dunn, having denied it over the last number of months. And as the Deputy Bruton has said, obviously other contributions made to Deputy Haughey, a former Taoiseach, by other business people has to be investigated as a matter of urgency by this House. And I'm now asking the Taoiseach that this House should sit and consider the implications of the admission made before the tribunal today after many months of denial.
But the Taoiseach insisted that the tribunal should finish its work and issue its report before any decision should be made on a new inquiry.
When we have the report and we see precisely what is necessary to do, then we should deal with these. And can I say this, Count Cordia, indignation to any particular side of this House on these kind of matters. And as far as I am concerned today, I would deem what we now know today is both tragic and deplorable.
There is nobody, in my knowledge, in any democracy in Western Europe, as a Prime Minister who's admitted to receiving £1.3 million as a gift from a private businessman. I don't think it's happened anywhere in the European Union since the European Union was founded, or indeed in any country in Europe since the war.
I will cover nobody. We will deal with this report comprehensively, and you needn't worry about that. You needn't worry about that.
Dunn Stores have already indicated that they're seeking the return of the £1.3 million from Mr Haughey. But if Mr Haughey hasn't paid tax on the money, he faces a stiff bill from the Revenue Commissioners. Margaret Ward looks at the legal, tax and financial implications for Mr Haughey following his admission to the tribunal.
It's not known what, if any, tax Mr Haughey may have paid on the money he now admits he received from Ben Dunn. The Revenue Commissioners have been taking a keen interest in the tribunal's proceedings. Today, evidence was given that Ben Dunn offered to give Mr Haughey another £1 million to deal with his tax affairs. A gift such as this would in itself be liable for tax. There are a range of scenarios facing Mr Haughey if he has not declared the £1.3 million. If he holds on to the money, he'll be liable for gift tax of around £382,000. He'll also have to pay interest to the Revenue Commissioners at 15%, giving a total bill of £620,000. But Dunn Stores, and Margaret Heffernan in particular, have made the return of the money. If they succeed in proving the money came from the company itself, Mr Haughey could be faced with repaying the entire £1.3 million. He could also be liable for gift tax on the interest that would have been earned, a total bill of £1.42 million. There could also be income tax implications. The money involved was in an offshore account, but interest from such accounts is liable for Irish tax.
There is specific anti-avoidance legislation dealing with the transfer of assets abroad, where the person transferring them abroad has power to enjoy the income, either directly or indirectly, and he may have problems in that area which are probably also investigated by the Revenue Commissioners. When you're talking about penalties, penalties for income tax evasion are much more severe. They vary from rather small fines with possible small prison sentences for conviction, summary conviction, to very serious fines and in one particular case a mandatory prison sentence for conviction on indictment.
Mr Haughey could also face problems with the tribunal itself. The Tribunal of Inquiry Act does provide for punishment for contempt. However, his statement speaks of mistakenly instructing counsel rather than misleading them. But while tribunal costs are usually paid by the taxpayer, Mr Haughey could end up paying his own.
This case, it appears that Mr Haughey gave information by written submission which was incorrect, and his counsel unwittingly gave information which was incorrect. And if it turns out that the Chairman's view is that much of the expense of this tribunal could have been saved by the correct information being given originally, it may have some implications in costs.
Whatever scenario finally emerges, today's statement is likely to cost Mr Haughey a great deal of money indeed.
As a politician, Charles Haughey managed the public finances. His private finances have long been the subject of speculation. Ingrid Miley has this report on the opportunity enjoyed by Mr Haughey.
I wish to talk to you this evening about the state of the nation's affairs. And the picture I have to paint is not, unfortunately, a very cheerful one. The figures which are just now becoming available to us show one thing very clearly. As a community, we are living way beyond our means.
In office, Charles Haughey was one of the first politicians to grasp the nettle of fiscal rectitude. It's widely accepted that his strategy of curtailing public spending in the late 80s helped to lay the foundations of today's economic success. However, there have always been questions about his own personal expenditure and wealth. He had come from modest beginnings to marry Maureen Lemass, daughter of former Taoiseach Sean Lemass. As an accountant, he set up the Haughey Boland accountancy practice, but once he went into politics, many wondered how he could afford what was by any definition an affluent lifestyle. In a documentary filmed in 1986, he permitted rare access to his private life.
I live here in Kinsale on the north side of Dublin.
His home was a Gandon-designed mansion which he shared with his wife and children Conor, Kieran, Sean and Emer. The house on 300 acres includes a small stud farm and a wide array of wildlife. According to the Land Registry today, since 1990 the property has been registered as being owned equally by Mr Haughey's 4 children.
My holidays are spent on an island off the coast of Kerry. It is called Inishvigalan.
On his island off Kerry, he maintains a holiday home where he frequently takes breaks with family and friends. He's an avid sailor, with much of his leisure time spent on board his yacht.
I enjoy the colour, the gossip and the animation of a day at the races, and occasionally to see my black and blue colours go past the winning post.
Steel defies top weight and wins the Irish National.
He's known for his keen interest in racing and owns a number of racehorses. He's also been a high-profile patron of the arts. Since his retirement from politics, Charles Haughey has chosen to guard his privacy. However, today's revelations will undoubtedly bring his private finances and lifestyle back under sharp public scrutiny.
And there we take a break. Still to come.